And it's been the hardest lecture for me to put together because it's an incredibly important topic. In the United States right now, we were talking coming over today, we are being bombarded right now in the United States as scientists with really misinformation that has impacted our funding, it has impacted the entry of young scientists into the career of medical research and research in general. It's impacted the funding of established researchers. And we are actually, not to overuse the term, in science, we are in an existential crisis in the United States. If anybody has ever followed me on LinkedIn or that, I post very frequently on what the impact of this is going to be on research. Not challenging, this is a good point for communication, not challenging the politics at all, but actually just talking about where we are and what the consequences could be. In the United States right now, 95% of all the drugs that are on the market can trace their origins back to fundamental research that is done in academia. And that is, I mean, given the conversations I've had at UL and in Trinity last week, it's exactly the same story. Good, discoveries in research, discoveries in medicine, and translation to medicine, is all built on the foundation of fundamental research. The idea out there that industry should be basically doing their own research in developing drugs is incompatible with the way research is done. Project lengths are too long. So why did we get ourselves into this situation? And I'm clearly not taking a political stance here. We got ourselves into the situation in part because it's our fault. It's our fault as scientists because we have not really been able to get across to Joe Plummer and Mike Farmer in Iowa what the importance of the $50 billion in NIH-supported research is, what the impact is on them. We have not been able to tell them that the money that is spent in Duke University or in University of Limerick or wherever the grants are because NIH grants can come here too, and we're not being able to tell them that that's going to affect their brother who has testicular cancer, their mother who has breast cancer, or their sister who has ovarian cancer. We've not been able to make that link. As Jer pointed out, one of the things that we lack as science, that we fail at, is that we sit in our cocoons where we talk to each other about our great science, like you and I did this morning, but we're not very good when we come and we talk to people, lay people, who are those who are actually paying taxes and telling those why it's important. And so what I've done today then is I don't want to portray myself to be an expert in communication science. That's not what I am. But I have a lot of experience. For this lecture, I actually went back. I keep every lecture I give. I've actually given 695 invited lectures in my career. And so the only reason I bring that up is not a boast or a measure, but it's just to tell you that I've gained some insight, I think, over those years about what things are important when you design a lecture and how to design lectures that are appropriate for the given audience. I'm actually going to give, in the second part of my talk this morning, I'm going to give the lecture that I gave yesterday. But I'm going to give it in a way that I can talk to people who are in the medical school and who are in the economics school, hopefully, and that you'll walk away with some vignettes of information that will help you understand what I do, what not only just me, how the field is going, and also will give you hope for the future with respect to cancer research. And so that when people are able to talk to all of you and ask you, is spending money in research a good thing? You can say, I heard this guy from Duke, and I was really impressed at the idea that if we communicate well, we will convince the masses that science is good, and that we won't get these affronts on science research for very long. So that's a very long introduction to what I want to talk today, but it gives you some idea of who I am and what I want to accomplish today. So I think it's very important, and I'll show you this talk structure in a minute. But one of the things that's incredibly important when you talk about any talk is to develop credibility. Okay, so I don't care whether you're talking to the lay people, who are organizing the latest run for cancer here. You have to be able to, when you talk to them, and you bring a message to them, you have to show them that you have some credibility. And so my credibility is really my pedigree and my training pedigree, and I put it up here for lots of reasons. One reason actually is to make the link right back to University of Limerick, because when that young scientist project that Jared talked about, the research was done here in the University of Limerick. When I was 15 and 16, I was allowed, you probably couldn't do it nowadays, I was allowed to come 2 days a week to do my research in the laboratories of Dr. Colin Birkinshaw here in the School of Chemistry, I think it was, in material science. So from there, as Jer mentioned, I went to Galway, a beautiful building up here. I went to Galway and I studied biochemistry under the mentorship of Dr. Dennis Hayden in Galway. And I got a scholarship to go to Stanford and Harvard to do my PhD. But Mary and I will tell you the long story about how suddenly we ended up in humid Houston because Dennis Hayden, I've talked about rabid dogs before. Dennis Hayden was like a rabid dog. He says, you don't want to be going to these places. You need to come to Houston. I had to look up where Houston was on the map. Okay? And then I remember talking to someone and they said, oh, Houston's great. It's a really lovely climate. It is like living in a freaking sauna. Okay? So we worked on Mary's birthday, July 31st, 1983. The doors opened in Bush Airport, our Intercontinental, and we walked out and we got hit with 100-degree heat, 92% humidity. But it was a really good experience because I ended up training. Oh, it's gone off for some reason. I ended up training here at Baylor College of Medicine under the mentorship of Bert O'Malley. That was where I basically started working on very fundamental aspects of how hormones like estrogens and androgens impact the biology of cancer. So I was trying to find a niche, and I think all the students here, no matter what discipline you're in, you want to find a niche. And so Bert was concerned, my mentor was concerned, that I was actually just going to continue kind of following in his coattails. In other words, what he was doing, I was going to enter into the field, and I would be kind of doing Me Too research. And he quite offensively told me one day that he didn't think that the path I was on I was going to be successful. And so this is also a little bit lecture on good mentorship as well. And so he said, you need to find your niche. And so Mary and I backed up again, and we went and we moved to, and you can't see, or you can, Philadelphia. And we went to Philadelphia, where I did a one-year fellowship in SmithKline. At the time, it was SmithKline Beecham. Okay, and I learned about drug discovery. And so now I had a niche, right? I understood hormone action in cancer, and I also understood drug discovery. I put them together and went back to Baylor again and joined the faculty. Stayed there for about 3 years. And then I'm not really sure how it happened, but unfortunately I ended up in the other half of this building. No, and I ended up in a company called Ligand Pharmaceuticals, which was a startup biotech in San Diego. And in that company, we developed the very first drugs that actually were designed specifically to hit the estrogen receptor, which is the major driver of the majority of breast cancers. And then finally, just to continue this loop, I ended up then at Duke University, where I've been as a professor at Duke University for 31 years. That, to me, I'm not sure I can beat that in my career, but I'm going to try to, because there are other cancers out there that we need to hit. So my biggest challenge here today is to keep your attention. And this is the biggest challenge that anybody in an audience has. There are competing thoughts out there that are just as important to me. Like, I know you're asking, what are you going to have for lunch today? Right? And you're thinking about whether you're going to go to the Eden Cafe or whether you're just going to grab something out of a food truck. Okay? And I know definitely that you're thinking about, is there live music in the hurlers tonight? You see? So these are the thoughts that so when you set up a talk, you have to try and capture the audience. Okay? Because by capturing the audience, the first thing you do to capture the audience, of course, is to figure out who your audience is. Now, I will tell you, I actually researched the audience today, and this is the truth, and I researched my audience yesterday. I do it every single time I do a talk. I ask Jer who will be there, I send him an email. Because if I'm going to talk to a group of breast cancer researchers who only do breast cancer research, that's a completely different talk than if I'm going to talk to donors at the Komen Foundation, a completely different talk. Now, I can deliver the same message, okay, but I don't need to deliver the details. What I want you to remember as we go through this is that people you won't remember many of the facts I'll talk about today, but you probably will remember some of the stories that I've told you, and you probably will remember the key punchline. Basic research leads to drugs. Drugs impact people with chronic diseases. So I'm not expecting you to understand anything about the estrogen receptor. I'm not expecting you to remember anything about the different types of cancers. You mention them in brief because there's always someone in the audience who wants a tad more detail, okay, than the other. So when in researching this audience today, I realized that there are people who are working on policy, there are people working on economics, there are medical students, there are biomedical students here, there are professors here. So my challenge is to develop a talk that keeps everyone interested. And the way you do it is, of course, is you go back to old Aristotle. Okay, and this is the design. This is really the only, if you want, slide that I've really lifted from the literature, because this is really the structure of every talk. If you go on to any lecture on science communication or policy communication or any sort of communication, every single talk should be designed in the same way. So he talks about logos, pathos, and ethos. Okay. Now, it's interesting because when I looked at this and I thought about this talk, I said, I kind of do this automatically because I've been lecturing for so long. But starting off, it's very hard when you're a young investigator and you're given a 10-minute talk, platform talk at a meeting. It's very hard to design your talk. And so you can hop on this triangle at any place. And I like to hop on always at ethos. Why are you qualified to give this talk? Well, I hope by this time I've talked enough about myself and Jer's talked enough about me that I think we've got over that. You can basically agree that I know what I'm talking about when I design these types of talks. The second is the values of the audience, and we've kind of talked about that. If I'll ask a question here, you don't mind. How many people here have been affected by cancer? So not directly, indirectly or directly. See, most of the people. So I already know that. I know it because the incidence of cancer is about 1 in 3 lifetime of different cancers, okay? And so that's now I already know that you are going to be interested in what I'm going to talk about. So I know that that is important as well. And then the final thing is the argument itself. And that is what I'm going to tell you. What are the facts I'm going to, what is the problem I'm going to address and what the facts I'm going to deliver. So I'm going to give you 2 or 3 of these slides before I kind of go in and show you by example what I'm talking about. So these are things that I think are important parts of a talk. And in fact, what I did was, before I gave this talk, I pulled my 7 graduate students and I helped them, we actually went through this process of designing talks so I could actually come up with some of these things that they thought were important in designing a talk. So the first thing that you should do is that you should be able, I don't care who you are, I don't care if you're a nuclear physicist, you should be able to describe what you do over a pint in the bar. Okay? And when I used to be the chair of the department, and I used to tell young professors when they came in, is that when they describe themselves and they describe what they do, they should be able to describe themselves in 1 sentence. Okay, so if you're working on, like I'm working on breast cancer, somebody says, well, Donald, what do you do? Well, I actually develop drugs for late-stage breast and prostate cancers. Every single person in the audience knows what I'm talking about. Now, you're a scientist. You might say to me, yeah, but what specifically? Well, I'm interested in the signaling pathways, but that's a level down. But my first sentence, everyone knows what I work on. And so today, in this one, what am I going to talk about over the bar? I'm going to tell you about the story about how I discovered, or in the global sense, I haven't worked in the lab in a long time, it's my trainees, but how we discovered a drug for breast cancer. And I hope to keep you interested for the remainder of about the 30 minutes when I tell that story. But I should be it should be the kind of conversation that you have over a drink in the bar. Every talk should have an elevator pitch. And multiple. In a 10-minute talk, it should be an elevator. I was watching the talks yesterday, and you guys did. You are very good at presenting in the first slide, or the opening slide, what the audience needed to take away. Because to be honest with you, do you know what the average attention span on a slide is? It's 30 seconds. That is the average attention slide that people can put on a slide. And so they're not going to remember a lot of the specific details unless they're really in that field. But what they want to be able to do is they want to remember the bottom line. So I would encourage you in a talk of, say, 10 minutes, 1 elevator pitch, in a talk of 30 minutes, 2 elevator pitches, and a talk of an hour, 4 elevator pitches. So elevator pitches are exactly what they say. You're in a ride in an elevator. It's been able to basically get your message across succinctly and very quickly. And in an elevator pitch, there are 3 elements that you don't always use, but there are 3 basic elements in an elevator pitch. The first is define the problem. The second is tell you how I solve the problem. And the third is data, if you want, to back up the fact that you can solve that problem. Okay, so if you think about it, even in the field of economics, or you can walk in and you can say, your elevator pitch would look something like, I've seen from your balance sheet that your sales of widgets have decreased. That's the problem. We have developed a new software program that analyzes sales, forecasts, blah 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 blah. And we have 15 companies that now have adopted our product our software, and their sales are going up by 20%. Now you've got me. And the next thing he's going to say is, when can I come and talk to you? Okay, so that's an elevator pitch. That's an elevator pitch not for a scientist. For a scientist is, we don't have any therapies right now for pancreatic cancer. Okay, I've found a new target in pancreatic cancer that we think is going to extend the life of patients with that disease. We've made the drug, we've tested it in animals, and it works in animal models. That's my elevator pitch. I haven't talked about any details, but you now know that I'm a pancreatic researcher who's really done some work, who's developed a drug, and you might be interested in talking to me further. So elevator pitches are an incredibly important part of a talk, and they're also good because in a 10-minute talk, that's all you have, right? And invariably, you're going to run out of time. By the way, never, ever go over. That is the killer for any presentation, because what people remember was McDonnell was so long-winded. They'll never remember. Stop laughing, Mary. But they'll forget the message. They'll forget. You're better off to finish a minute early, okay, on that one. But again, the elevator pitch is useful. And then the other reason it's useful is because you're already wandering off thinking about the hurlers again tonight, okay? And so what I'm saying is that the elevator pitch, again, in the middle of the talk, it may be slightly delivered differently, will bring you back, will bring you all back together again. So, I think about a talk like this, I try to think of a very good way of describing the difference between, if you want, a good talk and a bad talk. Okay. Now this is science focused, but it can be anyway. And I love the title that I made up myself. Okay. It was The Butler in the Library with the Candlestick. Okay. And so the idea is that, say, take a murder investigation. Okay. And so you have it out here. There was a murder investigation. A body was found. Okay. And there's two ways the story can be told. There's the story that is the most interesting, which is the way it's played on Netflix. Okay, and Netflix is the guards come running in. They enter the crime scene here. They basically quickly find the bullet. They identify the gun or something like that. They go back and they say that, oh, that gun was owned by Mr. X. They capture Mr. X, and everyone claps. Ends of credits, and everyone remembers the story. But then there's the nerdy science way of getting to the same story. And the same story is, the crime scene, the guys run in, and they said, the chromatographic analysis yielded inconclusive signal differentials. We need more replicates before drawing a primary conclusion. And in 16 months' time, we've actually been in the lab, and we've now come up with the data suggest a possible correlation, but causation cannot be inferred. That's the nerd, okay, telling the same story. But this is the story of, it was the butler in the library, okay, with the candlestick. And so make your story, keep your, you could, by the way, the end of this story is exactly the same. They got the villain, okay? But I'm not going to watch a Netflix special on chromatographic analysis, but I definitely will watch the story, which is maybe somewhat implausible, is that, within 48 hours they found the gun, the guy, and they've got him in jail. But they only have 30 minutes to tell the story. But you only have 30 minutes to tell the story as well. Right? And so you need to be able to compact your story into 30 minutes. So, I want to now, just before I move into my talk, move into examples of good and bad communication stories. Okay? One of the best ones, and this is my own opinion, is the British campaign that's now extended to the United States, the Know Your Numbers campaign. Does anybody know what this is? Oh, then it's not a great campaign. So the Know Your Numbers campaign is how to take measurements of cholesterol, glucose, blood pressure, your risk factors for stroke, your risk factors for heart disease, your risk factors for diabetes. And so it turns out that pretty much everyone who's ever gone to a GP to get a physical knows their numbers. You know what your cholesterol is, you know what your blood pressure is, you know what your heart rate is, you know those numbers. And this campaign has been extremely successful because it's taken a huge amount of science and boiled it down to numbers. I can't remember what the units are in America, but if your cholesterol is over 180, okay, by talking to your friends, well, I'm 180, I'm pretty good. Oh, you're 220, and you also know when you take a statin that you're going to. People understand that. It was a great communication program. I'm sorry you guys don't know it. Maybe you should. No, but that's an incredibly a good program. So then I took 3 examples of really, really bad communications. So this is, actually you can look this up, it's actually quite interesting. And it was a statement that came out in one of the English newspapers that people who eat oysters are more attractive. Okay, and so actually in this article what they did was they went down through where this came from, and it turns out it came from very bad communication from the scientist who actually did the work. He never said this at all. What he said was, he said that they did a study, and I went back and read this before this talk. They went back and he said that people who eat oysters, okay, I think it was, are generally most socially aware than people who don't eat oysters. And he concluded the fact that if you eat oysters, you're going out to the pub or something like that. But he published this, huh? Exactly. And so then what he did was he went, so it says, well, you know, the press office in the university saw that this had been picked up by the oyster eaters of America, you know, and they put out a paper saying that, you know, people who eat oysters are more attractive and things like that. And the story just built on itself. And then if you actually followed it then on Twitter, it was basically, you know, something like, oysters are aphrodisiacs, blah, 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 and so therefore they're a double whammy. They make you more attractive and they're aphrodisiacs. But this was just because the scientist who put out the original study didn't actually leave a conclusion. He put out the data and kind of say, but he didn't actually take responsibility and basically tell people what his story actually meant. The other one is artificial sweeteners are poisons. So if you read that paper, it was a Lancet paper, and this was published in The Guardian, which is not a bad paper, I don't think. And it was about artificial sweeteners and like aspartame and saccharides are poisons. They didn't say that at all. What they basically said is that people who take artificial sweeteners are generally people who put on weight faster, and people who put on weight faster get cardiovascular disease and things like that. It had nothing to do with artificial sweeteners being poisons. But that, again, was because in that paper, they didn't take pains to actually deliver. They had the data to tell them that, you know, artificial sweeteners lead to this false assumption that you can eat what you want and you're going to lose weight. But then it's the responsibility of the scientist, whether in talks with the media, either publishing the paper, to get it across. And the final one then is, I'm not going to go into details, same things, oral contraceptives cause depression. This was actually very recent, okay? And it wasn't true at all. What it basically was talking about is that it turns out that when the study was reanalyzed, what it was turned out is that the people who were taking oral contraceptives, this type of oral contraceptives, progestin containing, were generally people in the lower socioeconomic status because they were cheaper oral contraceptives. And depression is higher in people who are stressed out anyway. So again, you've got to be careful about the way you deliver the message. And I'll finish about one of my undergraduates told me about this story, which is this is about fake news, okay? So it's the same thing. Fake news is bad communication. Fake news generally doesn't come from it comes from somewhere. It's usually some little thing that's out there that people then fester on and build. But this one was a story about dihydrogen monoxide. So this was a story that came out about 7-8 years ago, and it was picked up by the Environmental Agency in New Zealand and in Australia, and basically put up on their news alert page. It was a prank. It was a prank by students in the University of, it's in California, one of them, it'll come to me in a second, Santa Cruz, University of Santa Cruz, on April Fool's Day. Does anybody know what dihydrogen monoxide is? Water. So the whole thing was about how water is bad for you and bad for your health and things like that. And so again, it just shows you how vulnerable we are. And so the biggest problem that we're dealing with really, okay, is it's social media, but we can't totally control the messages that we give. But I know personally, I'm really important about what I say. I say it in a way that if somebody retweets or whatever, any message I put out, that, you know, there's no way to misinterpret what I'm saying. You can reinterpret and interpret it in your own way, but it's very important to us as scientists and as practitioners of anything that we make sure that the message that we give cannot be misinterpreted. Okay, misinterpreted. It can be misquoted. It can be misstated, as it has. In fact, I was quoted on AP Press saying the other day that it said, "I can't work in this chaos," or something like that. That's not what I said at all. Okay, what I said was it was difficult to work in this chaos. Now they mean two different things. It's difficult to work in this chaos. It's understandable. I can't work in this chaos. I'm a nutter, right? That this guy is going off the rails. So it's different things. So I hope I got across the messages and really how to put it together, how to put a talk together, how to communicate. And so now what I'm going to try and do, and you'll tell me if I've been successful in doing this, is I'm going to tell you the story about the discovery of a drug. And I'm going to try and take the lessons that not lessons, that's a little bit, I take the pointers that I've made and see if I can try and show you where I've incorporated them into a story about breast cancer. Okay. Here's my elevator pitch. There hasn't been a new drug for the treatment of metastatic breast cancer in over 20 years. People who have metastatic breast cancer generally go on to classical chemotherapy, have a very poor quality of life, and a very short duration of response to classical chemotherapy. So my group basically, in a 30-year project, ended up discovering this drug. It's called elacestrant, or its trade name is called Orserdu. It's now approved in Ireland. It was approved in Europe in last September, and it was approved in the United States in January of 2023. So that's it. We did it. We did it. Now, why did we do it? And so here is something that I bet you, and here are some of the facts that I think are going to be very useful where you can discuss over the dinner table tonight. Just about, the prevalence of cancer. We are making progress, okay? And I'm going to show you in the last couple of slides just some of the major progress we've made in treating cancer. Cancer is no longer a death sentence. There's some cancers we still have problems. Glioblastoma, terrible problems. Pancreatic cancer is a really bad problem. But, childhood leukemias, we've basically learned how to treat them pretty much, all of them. Does anybody here know what the success rate is for breast cancer? What the 10-year survival is? It's 97%. Does anybody know what the 10-year survival rate is for the average 55-year-old woman? 97%. So we really learned how to treat that type of cancer, where we can manage it. We can manage it if it's caught in the late stages very well. I've got a friend of mine, and she's Pam. Pam wouldn't mind. Pam has been on these new drugs for not the drug I had, but another series of drugs for 15 years. We're managing this disease, this disease as a chronic disease now. So I don't want anyone to walk out thinking that we're not making progress. We're making tremendous progress, and in breast cancer, particularly good progress. And so that's an easier story to tell. But I want you to look at this because it's kind of interesting, because people keep forgetting that we're getting better at treating the disease. Unfortunately, we're not getting better at preventing the disease. Okay? Because if you look at the incidence, I could have used US figures, but I try to find the European figures. And if you look, it's approximately 100 patients per 100,000 per year present with breast cancer. Lifetime risk of breast cancer in Ireland is 1 in 8. 1 in 8 women lifetime will have breast cancer. But with the numbers being good, that obviously it's a great story. But there's something also interesting in this slide. You can see it. I said we're not very good at preventing cancers. So what is it about Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia? Well, it's clearly not because they're Eastern Europe, okay, and living. It's because of lifestyle. Okay, our lifestyle has changed. Okay, and if you actually looked at the cancer incidence in Ireland, I'm only guessing this because it wasn't collected back in the 50s and back in the 40s, I bet you it would have been much lower as well. And so it is clear breast cancer incidence, and I'm not saying that every breast cancer is caused by this, but breast cancer incidence is definitely affected by lifestyle. Do you know the biggest risk factor for breast cancer is? Does anybody know? Smoking. No, smoking actually. Actually, no, it's not. It's obesity. Obesity is the single biggest risk factor for breast cancer. So you said smoking? That's not a bad idea. I won't say it very loudly. It actually reduces the incidence of breast cancer. I won't say it very loudly. Because what actually turns out that smoking actually induces an enzyme that actually destroys estrogen, the driver of the tumor. So but I don't say that very loudly. Because
somebody's not obese.
No. So I said it's a risk factor, okay? That doesn't mean that if you're not obese, well, it does actually. It means that if you're not obese, you're at less risk. But it doesn't mean that obesity causes cancer, right? It's a contributing factor, okay? So we can take mice and we can make mice obese, and they won't get breast cancer. But we can make mice obese and then subject them to toxins, and they will get breast cancer. So the obesity actually is a contributing factor. That's one thing I actually, and thank you for bringing up that point, because one thing I want to get across is obviously I get lots of phone calls and people say, I got lung cancer, but I never smoked. Or I got breast cancer, but I'm thin as a rake and I look after myself and things like that. How did I get it? The bottom line is that for over 90% of cancer, we can't track it back to one event or one thing. And that's a big problem. That's why incidence prevention has been tough. We don't know what we're preventing. We know that obesity is a big thing. I'll tell you, there was a study that was published last year in the United States which said that if the average American, now this is a big tall order, if the average American dropped 2.2 pounds, 1 kilo, okay, we would reduce the number of cancers by 50,000 cancers a year in the United States. So that's why we're all excited about GLP-1 agonists, okay, because GLP-1 agonists are definitely reducing the incidence of cancer writ large. But I digress, okay? So we're talking about breast cancer again, okay? So I've told you that the breast cancer incidence is rising, it's actually fairly flat now, about 1 in 8, okay? But we want to prevent it. But unfortunately, with 1 in 8, we still have to stay vigilant about how to treat this cancer. And unfortunately, some women will present with late-stage breast cancers. They don't get regular mammograms. They present with metastatic disease. And we still have to develop therapies for those diseases. So let me tell you about our story. So our story is a success story of how to treat late-stage breast cancers that are called estrogen receptor positive. Now, I don't need to teach you much science. All you need to know is that 70% of breast cancers are what's called estrogen receptor positive. The estrogen receptor is a protein that sits inside the cancer cell, okay, and basically drives the processes in that cell that allows the tumor to grow. So estrogens are normal reproductive hormones. Of course, they're useful. They're very useful. We can't reproduce without them. But the point is that the cancer cell has somehow figured out how to usurp that system to actually drive the cancer. So guess what? The estrogen receptor turns out to be a phenomenal target for estrogen receptor positive breast cancers. And actually, sorry, there we go. The next slide. So this is one of my favorite slides because it tells you how we've evolved in developing therapies to treat estrogen receptor positive cancers. So I'm not going to go through all of this, but when Jer mentioned that his mom was diagnosed with breast cancer, okay, in 1978, there were no endocrine therapies. There were no therapies on the market to target the estrogen receptor. So I've just told you that 70%, and in fact in Ireland it's actually 80%, of all breast cancers are estrogen receptor positive. And now I'm telling you that as early as 1978, now for some of you that seems like the last century, well actually it was the last century, but for some of you that seems like a long time ago, but in terms of drug discovery, that's not a long time ago. There were no endocrine therapies. And then tamoxifen was discovered by a guy called Craig Jordan. Anybody who's at my lecture yesterday heard that, but I'll just tell you again because it's a great story. Craig Jordan was a postdoc in University of Manchester. His project was going south. He was sent over to ICI Pharmaceuticals to do an internship, basically because his mentor didn't know what the hell to do with them. And he got interested in this drug called tamoxifen. The bizarre thing about tamoxifen is that it wasn't developed as a breast cancer drug. It was developed as an oral contraceptive. It didn't work. Okay, in fact, it actually caused multi-power spurts, so it definitely didn't work. Though, mind you, the Catholic Church endorsed it. No. But the drug died. And what Craig actually found is that the reason that it didn't work as an oral contraceptive pill made it very good as a breast cancer drug. Now, let me just tell you about this, because I was at a meeting in the San Antonio Breast Cancer meeting about 15 years ago when he was getting an award. And that was 15 years ago. And they presented Craig with the Brinker Award. And in the presentation, Sir Richard Peto said that Craig Jordan has been responsible by his discovery of tamoxifen for saving 800 million years of women's lives. What a legacy. Just what a legacy. You know, Craig, he just passed away recently, but you know, that is an amazing legacy to have, and that was 15 years ago. And so this is all good news because it tells you that we started then to build on Craig's data and build better and better drugs. And this is where our drug, elacestrant, is the latest one that was approved. Now, I do need to tell, though, just a tiny bit of science here, and just to tell you how these drugs work. Now, I don't care if you're an economics major, you're going to understand this right now because it's very simple. The estrogen receptor, basically in this form, is dead in the cell, okay? And in this form, it drives the proliferation of the growth of breast tumors. And so what tamoxifen does is it basically comes in and freezes the receptor in this dead form. And so the better the killer, okay, that was the theory, the better the killer, the better the drug will perform. Well, you know, I told you about the 800 million years, but this is actually looking at patient outcomes. This is one man's postdoc project. Just amazing. You know, these are early stage breast cancers, I beg your pardon, early stage breast cancers. And you can see that if they take women and they put her on 5 years of tamoxifen, okay, that they reduce the chance of that disease coming back by 50%. That's amazing. Now, the newer drugs are even better than this. But the other neat thing is that the effect endures. The two lines don't collapse. So this is just amazing. And even in the late stage, it turns out it's 50% as well. The baseline is higher, but it's a 50% reduction. So that is probably one of the most major discoveries that has ever been made in the field of breast cancer. So as I told you, tamoxifen was discovered, it was an oral contraceptive, but wasn't made as a breast cancer drug. And so a lot of us then got into the field in the early 90s and said, you know, gosh, we know how this works. It works through this funny protein called the estrogen receptor. We're going to make better antagonists. And so we made better antagonists, and we never got anywhere. It turns out this tells us that we really didn't understand how this drug was working. These are all the failures. I have a list of 13 of them. I was involved in this one. I was involved in adoxafen, droloxafen. Yeah, of those, I was involved in 3 of them. And these were drugs that I would have bet, you know, my left arm that these drugs were going to work because they were phenomenal inhibitors, and they just didn't work. Tamoxifen was still better. So I'm going to tell you unfortunately, I have to give you one more science slide to tell you what the hypothesis was that we pursued 30 years ago. So let me tell you the story about this. So I told you in a minute that the estrogen receptor sits in 2 forms in the cancer cell, an on form and an off form, okay? On and off. And so we thought that, you know, if you just shift the receptor into the off form, that's all we needed to do. What we subsequently found, and I'll tell you the story about it, what we've subsequently found is that this protein in the cell is very malleable, okay? It actually doesn't exist in just one form or another. And what we needed to do was, we basically needed to figure out what tamoxifen was doing to the receptor, it was shutting it off, and then why it failed. That's all I need to tell you. And what we decided to do is to try and develop compounds that would actually get rid of the receptor. So not just inhibit it, get rid of it. So then shape doesn't matter. Okay, that was the basic concept. Okay. So we did that. I'm not going to tell you all the data, but we did that. We actually proved that this receptor could adopt different shapes and that was important. So we submitted the paper to the most prestigious journal in our field, or one of them. In Europe, it's Nature. In America, it's Science. Okay, and I will say, first of all, it got accepted. Okay, but it was a long haul. I'll always remember I was telling the audience yesterday that we got back the reviews, and one of the reviewers said the McDonnell laboratory has developed a highly sophisticated technology to detect allosteric changes in the estrogen receptor of unlikely importance. So we had to deal with that one. And guess what reviewer it was? 2. Reviewer number 3. No, reviewer, it's always reviewer number 3. So anyway, we did that. We developed our first drug. This is a sad story. So we developed the very first drug, I won't show it to you here, that degraded the estrogen receptor, and we got it into patients. It worked fantastic. We got into patients in 2002, 2003 in Leuven in Belgium. And then the worst thing happened. The company that was developing the drug, DuPont, who we licensed the drug to, was taken over by BMS. BMS killed the program, and the drug was just done, even though it worked. And I'm going to tell you that the drug I'm telling you that we discovered, elacestrant, is no better than that drug. The only thing that's happened, there was a 20-year delay in getting that drug into patients. But I had a group of students that were very, very much interested in still trying to find more degraders. Now, the good news about our failure, if you want, our drug, is that not all companies were like BMS. When they saw our published data, they all ran into it, and there are 13, we were talking about this morning, 13 drugs of this class that are now developed. They're all copycats of our first drug. You know, half of me is going, God, we missed on that one. The other half of me is going, wow, what a legacy. Okay, we started the field. Okay, and I'm gonna rely on that one because the other side is very hurtful. So we were still interested. So Suzanne Wardell, who was a postdoc in my lab, she was involved in the original failure, and she kept her eye out for interesting drugs, interesting pharmacology, and she found this drug called RAD 1901. Never heard of it. It was a drug that was originally developed for Alzheimer's disease, okay, and then dementia. Failed both of them. And then this company called Radius Health, okay, licensed the drug to treat hot flashes. So hot flashes are a condition of the postmenopausal patient gets when the estrogen withdrawal. They lose the ability to control the thermoregulatory centers in the brain, and they get sweats. Completely unannounced, soaking sweats, and they go away. And it's a big market, it's a big inconvenience, a big quality of life issue. So what they found was a bizarre dose response. This drug at low doses actually did decrease the hot flashes, but as you increase the doses, it actually either didn't have an effect, or in some cases, it actually increased the hot flashes. This was bizarre pharmacology, okay? So to make a very long story short, and I think this is the last science slide in this one, what Suzanne found is that this drug was working, and the reason it was working at low doses is because it was suppressing the hot flashes, but as you increase the doses, it started degrading the receptor, getting rid of the receptor, exactly what I wanted in breast cancer. So it failed in hot flash studies because it got rid of the receptor, but it actually turned out to be that failure made it a phenomenal breast cancer drug. So she went, I'm just going to show you and show, this is just looking at a curve. As I give mice with tumors this drug, the amount of the receptor goes down, okay? Exactly what we wanted it. It's not just tumors. If I look in the uterus, which is a reproductive organ, it goes down. If I look at models of tumor that are stimulated by tamoxifen, so these would be late-stage tumors, it goes down. So we basically found, by accident, a drug and got this drug repurposed, okay, as an estrogen receptor modulator. We brought it forward into what's called the Emerald-3 trial, and the Emerald-3 trial was published in 2022, and this is basically the survival curves. Now, before anyone goes, God, they're very small, these are huge differences when you actually look at the population. We have patients now that have been on this drug, who were on the drug in trials, have been on this drug for 6 years. Okay, now, so the reason these curves look so compressed is because these are very late-stage patients. Most of them are not going to respond to anything. Okay, and so now what we've actually done is subgroup analysis. We now know which patients are going to respond much better, and the average now is that every patient gets at least 1 more year before they need chemotherapy. Now, again, I'm apologizing to you that I can't cure this disease yet, but 1 year on average, okay, to patients who have got a death sentence, to be honest with you, is a lot of time, okay? And so we're very, very proud of that. And so this drug here, again, was approved. These are Suzanne and poor old Eric. He actually got bummed in the talk yesterday as well, because I forgot to mention him. But Eric was involved also in the discovery of this drug. And I'm not going to go and talk about it now, but I've had another very bright graduate student who's discovered a second drug called lasofoxifene, and it's now in phase 3 clinical trials. So I'm coming to the end here with 2 last slides. And one is because I've really focused this on breast cancer, and I hope that I've got across the fact that we are making progress in breast cancer. And I also hope that I was able to take just really, really complicated science, and that I was able to make even Jer understand how we got there, you know? And I haven't stopped picking on Jerry yet. but it is remarkable the progress we've made as a field in treating breast cancer. And I think that all of you will walk out hopefully impressed with that, but also impressed with the fact that prevention is really where we need to focus attention. Because, you know, I don't want to spend my life treating breast cancer. I would rather Mrs. Jones doesn't come into the oncologist's office with breast cancer. But I do think that it's going to be a tough nut to crack. But again, isn't that a great sales pitch for basic research? is basically to understand what are the factors that contribute to the development of breast cancer and how can we intervene so we can bring this 1 in 8 down to 1 in 7 down to 1 in 6. These are huge numbers. All right? So if you think about it, just do the numbers. That means that there's probably about 500,000 women in the United States right now walking around with breast cancer. This is a huge human health problem. But breast cancer is not the only one. You can see that there are other cancers that we have a lot of work to do with. Prostate in males is now, look at the numbers here. These are the annual cases of new diagnosis. Actually, I beg your pardon, I made a mistake. It's 2.5 million women, walking around in the United States with breast cancer. This is the latest update from in 2025 from the American Cancer Society. And you can see that, the numbers are absolutely staggering. Still with respect to cancer. We have a long ways to go. And I'm going to emphasize my point again. I'm focused on treatments. And in fact, I personally, for the rest of my career, want to move from using that word treatment to cure. Mrs. Jones, I'm not going to help you treat your cancer. I'm going to cure your cancer. And so my whole research program is directed that way. But if I was a young investigator getting into this field, I'd actually take on the bigger question. I'd ask, how can I prevent this cancer? Okay? How can I stop it from coming? How can I stop melanoma, bladder cancer? We know some of these things. Does anybody know, for instance, for bladder cancer, what's the biggest risk factor for bladder cancer? Smoking. Nearly all bladder cancer can be related back to smoking. Okay? Lung cancer, does anybody know what the biggest risk factor for lung cancer is? Smoking. Okay? 95% of all lung cancers occur in smokers. Now, that doesn't mean that 95% of smokers get lung cancer. That's the argument you're going to hear in the pub. Okay? Sure, Jason, didn't I know Mr. Murphy, and he'd been smoking his whole life and he never got lung cancer. But that's the argument, right? The 95% of people with lung cancer are smokers. Does anybody know what the biggest risk factor for melanoma is? No. Sunlight. Sunlight. Right? Bob Marley died of melanoma, okay, which is interesting. So it's not, people say, oh, it's white-skinned, fair-skinned Irish people. It's not. Melanoma is basically, it's reduced in people of darker skin because they got a tiny bit of light protection. But melanoma is an incredible killer of disease, but it's entirely preventable. Okay, put your sunscreen on. And let me see if it's any other one. Leukemia, cervical cancer. Does anybody know? That is 100% preventable. 100%. Vaccines, HPV vaccines. So we are making progress. And so the good news that I want to bring across today is that I'm a cancer researcher and I'm not a fatalist, because I'm actually the other way around. I'm very happy talking to taxi drivers when they ask me, Jez, he says, you're not making much prayer. Sure, didn't my aunt die of cancer? Yes, but your other aunt didn't, and your other aunt didn't, and your brother didn't, because we're making tremendous progress in this field. I'll finish with one last slide, and this is one of my most encouraging slides. This is, purposely I haven't told you what cancer this is. Okay, so this is the overall incidence of a cancer. Okay, and these are European figures. The overall incidence of cancer. Okay, of a particular cancer in males, females, and overall. Look at the difference between 1960 and 2020. Look at the mortality in this disease gone down. Can anyone guess what this cancer is? Did you? What? Bowel. It's bowel cancer. Exactly. It's colon cancer. And now you know why. It's because we've actually got colonoscopies are basically routine medical interventions, at least in the United States, for everyone over 40 every 10 years. So basically, there is no reason to die of colon cancer anymore. Okay? Because if you take out a polyp, okay, it's gone. A polyp is a precancerous lesion. Every cancerous lesion is preceded by a precancerous lesion. And so we can get this number down to 0. Okay? So this comes back to the fact that this is all good news. Okay? I'm sure that when you heard that there was this guy talking about cancer today, it was going to be doom and gloom. It's not. I mean, it's not over. But I think that you should be encouraged and you should be going away with a few messages today. One message is that we are making tremendous progress in most cancers. We still have some problems with glioblastoma and pancreatic, as I've told you. The second thing is that all of this progress is based on a massive platform of basic research. and that basic research is that which fuels all of these drug discoveries in the future. And the third thing I think that I'm hoping that the younger investigators in the audience walk away with is that prevention and understanding the molecular causes of this disease is basically paramount to actually eradicating this disease totally, which I think in some cancers we can absolutely do. And then finally, the bigger picture about presenting. I hope that the pointers that I gave you really hit home, at least somewhat, as you design your next 10, 30-minute talk or your next hour-long plenary talk. But there's no one way to do it, okay? But I think that by putting some structure in your talk, okay, by weaving in a couple of stories, which, unfortunately, I do that naturally anyway. As Mary says, sometimes my stories go around Clare and Longford and that, but they basically get back to the point, okay? But that keeps people interested. And so, when you frame the story correct, people remember it. If you give a bad talk, people are turned off. I hope that all of you are turned on today and that you feel that we have made great progress as cancer researchers. And I have no idea what's for lunch. There is music in the herders tonight. Thank you.
I think on the note of misinformation, I think, or like conspiracy theorists and all of this, do you have a response, like a quick response to the questions like they already have a cure for cancer, like they're just hiding it from us type of
Yeah, I can't tell you how many times I've heard that. Usually I can kind of go back in a personal way with that one. I say I love my family tremendously, and cancer is endemic in my family, and if there was a cure for cancer that I knew of, don't you think that I would actually make sure that they had access to it? So you bring it really personal, really quick, because I think that always works, because that actually embarrasses the questionnaire. The person asked the question. So that's exactly the answer that I use and I've heard that 100 times, that question. The pharmaceutical industry is hiding the cure. They want to, they want to make money on the drugs. But if you, and I don't necessarily want to embarrass someone. That's not the point. But the point is that shuts them up because they go, oh, that's very personal, right? So that's my answer.
Yeah, that's very good.
Yeah.
Because there's just so many things you want to say, but like that person isn't receptive.
That's right. You don't go
so
exactly.
It's very complicated to answer in a quick like.
So you're right. I think there are a few. It's interesting because you don't have to prepare yourself for 1,000 questions because it's usually the same 5 or 6 you get answered. One, and I told you the other one is my uncle Matty smoked all his life and he never got cancer. And I said, well, isn't he lucky? The answer is, isn't he lucky? And then I just go down and said, but the problem is that for the majority of cancer patients, they weren't so lucky. And so I always think that if you throw it right back at them, and I'm not being offensive. It's one of the best defense is a good offense. It's the way, because that shuts them up because they can't process that information because now you've made it personal. Yeah. Yes.
Thank you very much, Donald. I come from the School of Law, PhD candidate in the School of Law. I really enjoyed your presentation. You didn't lose me anywhere. Followed up everything, including the hydrogen
monoxide.
so it was good. I liked the way you were talking about studying the audience.
Yes.
So at times I struggle. My research is about evaluating the foreign policy of Ireland, especially in the UN setup.
Yeah.
So at times I really struggle when I have to break down
the audience
to another audience. When I'm faced with lawyers or politicians, it's easy for them to follow up what's happening. So my question is, this whole thing of breaking down and simplifying the topic, does it involve substituting certain concepts with easy language?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So I tried today. I boiled. I for those of you who were at my talk yesterday, you'll realize there was a lot more data. Okay, so what I try to do when I'm talking to different audience, if I'm cross disciplines, okay, personally, I try to reduce everything down to diagrams, down to cartoons, or down to simple messages. Okay, I have data, a couple of pieces of data. There's in science, it's unavoidable to include some types of data. But I truly mean what I said, is that a nuclear physicist should be able to sit down and tell me what they're doing. I don't need to know about quantum theory, okay? But I'd like to know what they're doing. You know, you're a lawyer studying, as you said, say, foreign policy. Well, actually, I'll tell you, you've already got me interested. I'm actually interested to know what you do. Okay, so I think that, you know, speaking to people across disciplines, first of all, people on the whole are generally interested in what other people do. Okay, so just think because you're in foreign policy that me, a breast cancer researcher, is not interested in, because my field is impacted by foreign policy just as well. So I think that I wouldn't be worried about that, but I do think that you need to tone it down. Okay, and that's what I tried to do today. Now, if I'm talking to, which I have done, to high schoolers, I'll even bring it down even further. Okay, like I might not even mention. Well, I have to mention estrogen receptor, but I may not show any of the data about getting rid of the estrogen receptor. I'll just say inhibiting. So I bring it really down. But then, if I'm talking to my peers at a Keystone conference, I'll have crystal structures up on the board. You know, stuff that people want to hear. The other way to do it, which I find very useful, if I have a mixed audience, and this is kind of what I did today, is that you have simple and you go a little bit deeper, back to simple and you go a bit deeper. So now people aren't walking around saying, God, that was a waste of an hour. Okay, at least they learned something. So these are things that I promise you, I actually think about when I'm designing the talk. I think I said it to Mary the other day, for every hour lecture, now obviously I'm not repeat lectures, but for every new lecture I do, it takes me 20 hours to prepare it. It's 20 to 1. I think any lecturer is probably about the same. And that should be, of course, research, but it all should be, you know, how to put a cohesive story together. And I use that word not loosely, story. Even when you're teaching, you know, biochemistry 101, okay, it's always better to teach it in a story. Students will remember it. So I enjoyed your comment. Thank you. Thank you very much.
I was just interested because you show it a 30-year story, and that in retrospect has a fantastic narrative throughout, but I presume living it, there was a lot of clouded moments. There were a lot of...
Mary's up talking next. Well, yeah, there were, yeah.
I think that comes back to how we communicate, because primary research by its nature is not always evident what the translation is going to be or the success rate is going to be. Do you have any comment on the tools potentially that you would use to communicate how vital primary research is, even the failures?
So, you know, it's a good point. I've never really talked about the I mean, that's a flaw. It's funny. Okay, let me come back and say. So, you know, it's funny. I always remember when I was a junior faculty member, you'd go to a conference and you'd hear Dr. X, the luminary, standing up and he's talking, and you'd go, God Almighty, does everything work in their lab? But what you don't realize is behind every successful postdoc, there's 15 who are, you know, not. And so I don't know that I do that. I probably do it more often in my office with students when they're obviously the projects are going south, and you say, you know, I've been here before, and here's the number of students I've trained. They've all got out, you know, things like that. But you know, it's a good point. We don't do a very good job at actually. We're doing a great job of telling the success. We don't do a very good job of telling people how many failures we had to make on that way. And I think that's important. Well, you know, exactly. I mean, I could ask some of the scientists, you know what is the average success rate of an experiment? You know what it is, you're a scientist. It's 10%. The average success rate of a scientific experiment is 10. So that means that 1 in 10 experiments work. Okay, and to be honest with you, it does take a certain type of person to actually keep doing that every single day. Okay, there's a couple of us are maniacs, and just we enjoy pain. but I think I think your point is well taken. And maybe when I present this the next time, what I should do is basically talk not only about the successes, but where we thought we were home and we weren't. Because I think it's a very good point.
I think
yeah.
Probably, like, as you talked about, you engage heavily in social media. That's very important.
Yeah.
We're challenged often with the why.
That's right.
Should we fund? Why should we fund? Why should taxpayers fund this?
Yeah.
You know, if this doesn't go anywhere, or if this.
Yeah.
But it's part of the recipe that many components of it don't actually go anywhere. But there are phrase
Well,
that follow through?
I think that I tried to do that today by saying, telling you about Craig Jordan's success story, 800 million years of life, right? That's why we do it. So I think that's one way of doing it. Personally, and I think that even Jared agrees, I'm very much of an optimist. I'm very much of a glass half full. There's the others, the glass half empty, and then there's the Irishman. You know that? The glass is never empty because you can always fill a half empty glass. So I think that maybe I'm in the latter class. Any other questions? Yeah.
You started out talking about how we communicate to the masses, whether that's, I think, Joe from Iowa.
Yeah. Matt the farmer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The government, whoever's
Yeah.
funding it.
Mm-hmm.
What do we need to do differently, sort of on a large scale, to change what we're doing to address that?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. So first of all, we as scientists are inclined to. I would consider myself. Oh, this is very arrogant, to be media savvy. Okay, I actually use the media a lot. Okay, I've got good relationship with reporters, and I, when we have a good story, I'll contact them. And I promise you, the main thing is to bring visibility up, not just visibility to my lab, but visibility to the field. So that's one way. I'm not being disrespectful to you. You don't have that connection yet at this time, but I do use social media very wisely. Okay, I will, post. You can look. Let's link together, and I'll show you. I'll post about papers, but then I'll put down what the consequences. I'll always have something. Listen, this is a paper. You don't need to read it, but what this is saying is blah 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 blah, and I'll put it in terms that my mother over in the nursing home would understand. So that's one thing. That's one thing. Being able to take your study on whatever it is, encapsulating it in 3 or 4 sentences, and using social media. That's one very easy way to do it. Okay. I generally, personally, use LinkedIn. I don't use Twitter anymore because. But that's the sort of thing. Let me just finish this. So the other thing I think is very important is that we as scientists are inclined to be very good at talking to other scientists. I know there's non-scientists. We're very good at talking to non-scientists. And to be honest with you, I don't want to embarrass my wife Mary again. But one of the things I do is I'll come home and I'll talk to Mary. And I'll tell her the story. And if she doesn't gloss over, then I know that actually I've hit the point. And she'll back up how many times she has to listen to me with a glass of wine in the evening about a new story. So talk to your. I think the analogy about you should be able to tell your friends over a pint of Guinness what you do. What you do is not boring to them. People are nearly everyone is interested in science. Okay, but if you start talking about dihydrogen monoxide or whatever it is, you've lost them. But if you talk about water, they'll be there. If you talk about your science in simple terms, they'll want to. And the best way to know if you're hitting home is if they ask you a question. Okay, and if they don't ask you a question, you're either above or below where you need to be. And the other last thing I'll say is practice. Okay, I told you, and I wasn't being too arrogant. I've given close to 700 plenary invited lectures, so I'm used to it. I'm used to people looking at me in the face and going, what's he talking about? And so the next time I learn, that's not the way I'm going to deliver that message. So learn from your own, from the input. And then the last thing, just looking at you, I know you're probably a PhD student, right? Okay. Talk to your mentor. Ask your mentor basically to critique your talks. And I would say before you go to a professional meeting, okay, use the best critics you know, the people in your lab, to critique your talk before you go. Because the worst thing is to stand up and be unprepared. The second worst thing is to go over time. Okay, I know, I saw, no. My talk was finished. I watched it, Jared. It's exactly 12:30, don't worry.
You mean constructive criticism?
Yes, critiques. Yes, critique. Yeah. Oh, it's absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's really important, and I think that the best people to do that are the people in your own lab, because you're not really going to be offended. Yeah. Yeah.
Actually, our question is more of a comment, and I'd like to say thank you so much for that lecture.
Oh, I appreciate it. Thank you.
I'm a scientist. I'm also not a researcher. I'm here with my colleague Sarah Blake, and we actually work in the marketing and communications department.
Oh.
And part of our job is to support researchers and academics like everybody in this room to do exactly what you've talked about today.
Fantastic.
So that's why we came. And
thank you.
We were really interested in your perspective.
Yeah.
On how to kind of, I suppose, get everybody in this room over the line and try to think like we think.
Yeah.
In terms of how can we communicate the amazing research that's been done in the university to a general audience.
And we're working with academics and researchers all the time to support you guys. So I just wanted to use your platform. I'm really sorry for hijacking.
No, it's exactly. I'm really delighted you did that. I'm really delighted. Yeah.
Thank you. To just say that we are here for support. So there are 4 faculty marketing and communications officers, and it's our role to support you guys in communicating your research. So we're doing that every single day, whether it's through media, through social media, through the website, through news, through liaising with editorial partnerships. Exactly. So if you want to get in touch with us, myself and Sarah can hang around for a few minutes after the talk to chat to anybody. But we have a faculty marcoms email address, so it's facultymarcoms@ul.e if you want to connect with us.
So actually, thank you for bringing that comment up, because you asked me how we can do it, And so actually, I have a very good relationship with Sarah Avery, who's the head of communications at Duke, and so I do 2 things. I don't send every paper to them. I send the ones that I think that are of public interest. And remember, I'm not trying to get people to donate money to my research by this. That's not productive. It's not. It's so that people down in the pubs in Limerick will say, did you see that story from UL yesterday? Now what happens is that UL gets credit. That's what you're doing it for. And so that when the next vote comes up to increase funding for biomedical research, the fellow says, geez, they're doing great research up there in UL. That's the thing you're trying to get across, right? And so Sarah, she's a phenomenal person. I will write maybe the first draft sometimes I won't write the press. I write the bullet points of what I want to hit. They'll convert it into a press release, and then they'll put it onto Eureka or the other sites and things like that. So that's another great avenue. By the way, last thing, always go through your PI. Don't do it on your own. I've seen people go directly to the press office, and that is a recipe for disaster. Go through your PI. Yeah.
Thank you.
Welcome. Yes.
Thank you so much for the talk.
Thank you.
I learned very much. So I'm a PhD student, and my PhD is about refugees and migrants' participation in clinical research. And I believe that, especially in the US, there's a lot of data as to the long history of disparity, especially for the ethnic minority groups.
Yes.
So my question around this is, how do you communicate your research to such groups of populations that have had a long period of disparity, especially that they've been at the receiving end or maybe the negative side of clinical research? So how do you communicate? Outstanding question. I was actually asked that question yesterday by Ruth Clifford. Ruth Clifford asked me this. She's an oncologist at UL, a medical oncologist, asked me the same question. So it's actually interesting because I'm going to talk about we in the Duke Cancer Institute, how we do it. So there are 2 cancers that are particularly prevalent in African Americans. One is triple negative breast cancer, and the other is prostate cancer. And we could stand up on our bully pulpit till we go blue in the face, and you're right. There's been an incredible amount of justified resistance from people of color and Hispanics from entering clinical trials. Mistrust of the medical system is the main thing, and a lot of this is coming back from the Tuskegee affair back in the 40s, I think it was. Okay. So what we did was we actually did something different. We actually went to the churches. We went to the Baptist churches and approached the pastors in the church, okay, and talked to them about the importance, okay, because they were a little bit more receptive than the average. And then once the pastors were engaged, okay, the congregation got very engaged. And now our prostate cancer screening program for African Americans is one of the most successful in the United States. So we had to be innovative. Okay, there. Now, of course, that involved communications because we had to get out there to the pastors, and then the pastors had to be educated as to how to get this message across. We have the same thing for triple negative breast cancer, where basically we go out into the communities, okay? And we have an office led by Tomi Nakanamichu, who actually does these community engagement events, okay? So putting ads in the newspaper is not going to work, right? Because you're not going to convince anyone. But you have to have someone who is, we talk about credibility, it has to be somebody with credibility who goes into those communities. So at Duke right now, in Durham, where Duke is based, we are 30% if you come non-Caucasian, okay? We're 30% non-Caucasian. But our clinical trials, okay, are grossly underrepresented in minorities and underrepresented minorities.
grossly. And so that's why we are trying to do it, so that we want the enrollment in our trials to reflect the demographics of our community. But it's a very hard point. But we are getting there, and we're trying, but we have to be innovative. The old thing of standing up and giving lectures like this is not going to work in this environment.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Yeah.
So Don, I think we'll have to end if that's yeah.
No, of course. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you. Yeah.